Welcome students. Today we are picking up an important topic of climate finance, which is very much important to your examination as part of environment. So this international summits, to understand them in deep, we need to actually get into nitty-gritties of climate finance, and this has been even talk of the town even in the recently concluded Bonn climate talks. So these are setting stage for actual climate conference of COP, Conference of Parties of UNFCCC. So without any delay, let's get into the topic and understand what actually it is and what is the necessity and intricacies of this climate finance. So regarding climate finance, if you want to define it, it is either direct financing or indirect instruments. When I say instruments, it's financial instruments. What is it? It's either direct financing or indirect instrument to adapt or mitigate the impact of climate change. So is it clear? Would again redefine it. It means it is either direct financing or indirect instrument used to adapt or mitigate the climate change. So this is what actually the climate financing is all about. So what kind of funds are available? How the financing happens? If you look at that, broadly you have 3 to 4 funds. One is Global Environment Fund. Second one is Adaptation Fund. Which means these two are different from the third one. This Global Environment Facility is actually facility which is under supervision of World Bank. This Global Environment Facility is for mitigation. I think you're aware of what mitigation is and what adaptation is. Mitigation is stopping climate change from happening. All the mechanisms, all the technology that you deploy to stop the climate change comes under mitigation. But when it comes to adaptation, it means you're accepting the change, and after accepting the change, you are interested to adapt to it, adapt to the conditions around it. So this is adaptation. And the third kind of fund is loss and damage fund. This is slightly important one and slightly complicated. To understand loss and damage fund, you need to look at this image where Simon Coffey, a minister of Tuvalu, was appealing that this used to be his playground. Earlier, this used to be his playground where he was playing. Next generations doesn't have the same piece of land. Why? Because of the climate change, those islands were submerged. So he was giving the speech. The Simon Coffey was giving speech standing in the same place. That means the loss and damage has already happened, and the damage is irrevocable. That means when you can't reverse it, this irrevocable damage, when happens, needs a kind of compensation fund. That compensation for an irrevocable change is given to the countries which are more affected from climate change, and such fund is loss and development fund. Loss and damage fund. So loss and damage fund, I think, is clear now. If all these mechanisms are clear, let's understand the version of each party which are involved in this climate finance, why is it not still effectively in place? So let's first understand the version of developing countries. Sorry, developed countries. Developed countries are those who already developed financially as well and also has capability of technology to deploy, which could either mitigate or adapt according to the climate change. So these developing countries are attempting differently. When they say we would transfer the climate finance to least developing countries, why should we help developing nations? Is their version, and they are actually not ready to accept the past injustices or inequalities created due to climate change. So that's their version, and they are not actually transferring the $100 billion which are necessary to mitigate it. By 2015, the climate financing was actually envisaged that it would begin by 2025 in the COP 2015 in Paris. So this is the version of developing countries. Then what is the version of developing countries? Developing countries would say any finance. If you look at the first slide, it says either direct financing or indirect instruments. When you say indirect instrument, it may include soft loans, not grants. Direct financing includes grants. And this is like loans. So, developing countries say they need grants rather than loans. So they don't need loans, instead they need grants, is the version of developing countries. So there is no consensus here. What would least developing countries would say? These LDCs are urging, please start it in whatever way you have consensus, at least in the fields where both developed and developing countries accept, at least start those mechanisms so that something happens. I think the versions of these three kind of countries are clear by this discussion. So if you understood, we emphasized on what kind of climate change instruments are available, what kinds of funds are available, what climate finance is, and what is the version of various countries. We hope that in COP29, this climate financing would reach to a proper consensus and the mechanism would start immediately. So with this, I would say, let's attempt a mains question. You can attempt it and post in the comments. So with that mains question, as mentioned here, it says, emphasizing the necessity of climate finance instruments, highlight the complexities involved in global financing mechanism. Here, this part, you can mention the versions and what are the challenges that are raised by various stakeholders like developed, developing and least developed nations. And in the first part, you can just mention the gravity, the seriousness of the climate finance. Hope you understood some information from this video and you would be able to use it to answer this question. So another day with much more informative video, I'll be back before you. Till then, bye and thank you.